Well, thank you, Zainab. Actually, about 15 years ago, I decided I wanted to read postmodern theory systematically, and at the time I was spending my summers at the beach in Bethany Beach, Delaware, out here, and I'd go out to the beach every afternoon with Baudrillard or Derrida, and it was quite a postmodern moment to be out there with reading that work when it was very much unlike what anybody else was reading out there. Begin with an apology, I have no PowerPoints. I actually like the idea of a PowerPoint, but the reason I don't have PowerPoints is Nathan Jurgensen usually does PowerPoints for me, but he's been otherwise involved with this conference, so I am PowerPointless. Maybe even pointless.
Sorry.
This all starts my talk and this conference, I think, and the meetings that we had, the seminar that we had for several years, with the point that much of the literature on the internet, Web 2.0, etc., is largely atheoretical. I think what's amazing about that is I've listened to about 8 very theoretical presentations at this conference, and so I think we've brought the theorists associated with Web 2.0 and the internet out of the woodwork. One good example of that, however, is a book that's been mentioned a couple of times today, and that's Axel Brunn's book, Blogs, Wikipedia, Second Life and Beyond, From Production to Producage. I'm never quite sure how he pronounces that. But that book is a very bottom-up book, and it's so bottom-up that it doesn't go very far up anywhere. There's a little in the way of generalization in that book, and there is absolutely no theory in that book. The problem with doing that kind of bottom-up analysis, to not theorizing the question, is that 150 years of work in social theory is being ignored here, and it's work that could help in understanding Web 2.0. So that is the perspective, that the absence of that kind of thinking is the perspective that lies with the roots of this conference and the working group, as I said. Now, the natural starting point, it would seem, would be to wonder whether modern social theory has any applicability or utility in terms of thinking about Web 2.0. After all, the web is modern, isn't it? And so it would make sense that modern social theory would apply. But the fact is that modern social theory has proven to be of limited utility in analyzing the web. And worse than that, it tends to distort our perspective on the web. Among the examples are the fact that the modern tendency to think in binary terms. So modern theory would tend to lead you to think in terms of web 1.0 and 2.0, or distinguish between the professional and the amateur, or closed and open. So that kind of binary thinking, I think, is distorting when one thinks about Web 2.0. Similarly, modern thinking lends in the direction, or tends in the direction, of grand narratives. A grand narrative of Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, or from the physical to the digital world. Another grand narrative that one sees in the literature is the demise of the consumer in the context of Web 2.0. So Jeff Howe says that the consumer is, quote, an antiquated concept. And Clay Shirky says that the consumer is Internet's most recent casualty. We are all producers now. Again, that kind of binary economist kind of thinking. Similarly, you see talk in that literature of not just the death of the consumer, but the death of the producer as well. In my view, as we'll see, both of those are alive and well in a pastiche, to use a postmodern term, that might be called the prosumer. The problems with a modernist approach are clear in, and I'm going to mispronounce this name, it was mentioned earlier, Van Yanathan's book, Siva Van Yanathan, I'll call him Siva from now on, entitled, it's a 2011 book called The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry. Now, those of you who know me and my work know why I'm attracted to that book, because of its topic and because its titles Its title is similar to, if not outright rip-offs of, two of my books that we mentioned before, with no citation at all. One is The McDonaldization of Society, as opposed to the Googlization of everything. And the other is The Globalization of Nothing. And actually, I have a book in process with a former graduate student called The Outsourcing of Everything. So I think I have all of those possibilities there. So drawn to that book, which I think ultimately is a disappointing book, what interested me about it was how modernist it was. It has, for example, a grand narrative, and that grand narrative is that Google has permeated our culture. It has permeated everything, including us as subjects in our memory. It has permeated the world, permeated knowledge, including higher education, students, scholarship, and research. So literally, he wants to argue that we have seen the Googlization of everything. And in his conclusion, instead of Googlization, Siva offers another grand narrative that he calls the Human Knowledge Project, in which the goal is to make the world's information universally accessible. So he not only operates with a grand narrative, but he poses a grand narrative as an alternative to the perspective that he's critiquing. There are many other modern characteristics. So modernist theorists are trotted out, such as Wedel and Dewey and Habermas, but not very much is done with them. The book is devoid of use of any kind of postmodern theorists. The closest he comes is to employ Richard Rorty's work, but when he talks about Rorty, he uses Rorty in the context of a modernist concern with truth, rather than the postmodernist concern that I'm going to mention of keeping the conversation going. It is a centered analysis as opposed to a postmodern decentered analysis, with Google exemplifying everything that is positive and negative about the internet. So it's a decidedly modernist book which exemplifies the point that, to me, modern theory has not proven to be useful and may even be destructive in terms of analyzing the internet. The goal here, however, is not to rehash the problems with modern social theory and with its applicability or lack thereof to the internet and Web 2.0, but to argue that postmodern social theory has great applicability to them. The easy and, I think, useful application of postmodern theory suggests that Web 2.0 is best seen as a postmodern world, arguably the paradigmatic postmodern world. In my view, postmodern ideas apply far better to this world than they did to the world roughly 1970 to 1990, in which they were created. So in a sense, the postmodern theorists and many of their ideas anticipated the realities that exist in Web 2.0. Now, as many of you know, postmodern social theory peaked roughly between 1970 and 1990 in Europe. It flamed out there and never had much traction in the United States, especially in American sociology. It does have life in other fields, but not in sociology and not in the United States. If anything remains of it, it is the ideas of individual thinkers, such as Foucault, who may or may not be associated with postmodern theory, Baudrillard, Butler, Verstager, etc. But it's more, the importance is more their individual works and their individual ideas and individual theories than being part of a postmodern theory. So I think that the demise of postmodern social theory, or actually it never having been born in the United States, is extremely unfortunate in general, and especially unfortunate in terms of understanding Web 2.0. I've long found important ideas in that literature for thinking about the social world. So that Zainab mentioned my book Enchanting a Disenchanted World, where among other things I use Baudrillard's ideas of implosion and simulation and time and space manipulation in order to analyze what I call the cathedrals of consumption. But again, I don't want to either here bemoan the fate of postmodern social theory, but to argue that the new world of the internet, social media, the prosumer, is difficult, if not impossible, to understand and explain without postmodern social theory. Under the heading of postmodern social theory, I always distinguish between three concepts. One is postmodernity, which implies that there's an epochal change from modernity to postmodernity. I always think that's a very un-postmodern thing to say, because it is a grand narrative, and so I'm not going to utilize that concept here. Rather, I'm more enamored of the concept of postmodernism, which implies that there are cultural and social forms that are distinctive to the contemporary world, but that they are combined with various kinds of modern phenomena to produce distinctively postmodern pastiche type phenomena. And then thirdly, there is postmodern social theory, and that is this set of theoretical ideas that are generally included under the head of postmodern social theory. And so I want to use those ideas, or some of those ideas, to demonstrate their applicability to Web 2.0, social media, the prosumer, etc. In doing this, I am using and operating from a distinction that Zygmunt Bauman makes between a sociology of postmodernity and a postmodern sociology. A sociology of postmodernity, which is what Bauman does, is a modernistic analysis of the postmodern world, whereas a postmodern sociology would be the kind that Baudrillard does, especially late in his career, being irrational, relying on science fiction kinds of analysis and things like that. So whenever I'm playing with postmodern ideas, I'm always doing it from the perspective of a modernist doing a sociology of postmodernity. I have here a modest goal of just trying to illustrate the applicability of several key postmodern ideas to the domain of Web 2.0. But the ultimate goal, one I'm planning to work on with P.J. Ray, is to develop a more coherent, a more integrative, ironically a more modern, postmodern analysis of these phenomena. So, to run through some concepts, starting with Rorty, who I mentioned before, the key in Rorty is the notion of keeping the conversation going. And this stands in contrast to the modern perspective of seeking absolute truth. And it stands in contrast to conceptions of modern science, where the goal is to solve problems or to find the answer. From Rorty's point of view, truth is always elusive, it's never attained, but keeping the conversation going is a good in itself. It seems to me that the internet and social media are incubators for lots of Rorty's thinking about conversations. What we see there is near endless remixing. Wikis, Wikipedia, blogs all reflect this kind of keeping the conversation going. Google's indexing algorithm, which is constantly underdeveloped, never final, never a fixed kind of directory, again reflects the same kind of thing. We can also think about Avery Brunn's, Axel Brunn's work on the producer, the productive user, who comment on, who remix, who are mashing up various phenomena. By the way, one of the issues we deal with is the relationship between Brunn's as producer and the concept that we prefer a prosumer. That concept came out in 2008. It has not caught on widely as a concept. It's not a particularly pretty concept, and prettiness makes a difference in creating concepts. But more problematic is the fact that what Brunn's does is to privilege production within presumption. That is, the concept of the producer is the productive user. And it seems to me that what he does is to replicate the productivist bias that haunts much of social theory, and he replicates that within the realm of what I would prefer to call prosumption. And as a result, and a third problem with Bruns's conceptualization is that it downplays consumption. But from the point of view of going back to Rorty, producage produces what Bruns calls artifacts. And artifacts are never finished products. They are, in fact, the polar opposites. They are inherently incomplete, always evolving, never finished. They are really textual conversations like those that Rorty is discussing. And of course, we see many examples of artifacts on the internet, Web 2.0, such as blogs, wikis, open source software, folksomies, and social networking sites, which all fit Bruns's definition of an artifact. Artifacts are particularly clear on creative sites where remixing and mashing up, or mashups, reflect this process of producing artifacts. From Derrida, we get the concept of decentering, which stands in very strong contrast to the modern tendency to look for the core or the center of virtually anything. So Marx, of course, was looking for the core of capitalism in labor, in the labor theory of value, and much of the history of Marxian theory has to do with looking for other kinds of centers. The critical theorists were looking to culture as the center. In Empire, Hart and Negri are operating with a kind of decentered sort of Marxism, but nonetheless focuses on empire and multitude. It seems clear that the internet and social media have no center. They fit this definition or sense of decentering. Bruns argues along these lines that the Web 2.0 has no hierarchies but heterarchies or networks. And so there is no broadcast from the center in his terms, but innumerable interactions at all points in the hierarchy. So hierarchies involve a shift away from a focus on the core and the center, on the tall peak, and a movement toward the periphery. Chris Anderson's long tail would fit this definition of decentering, but interestingly to Bruns, Anderson does not go far enough. Anderson, as you know, has the single one-dimensional continuum from popular to less and less popular phenomena. Whereas what Bruns proposes is a kind of Hershey's Kiss shaped phenomenon where there are all kinds of those continua included in that. And so he's trying to multiply the imagery that exists in Anderson's work. The problem with the Hershey Kiss imagery, as you can understand, is it does seem to have a center, so there's a kind of contradiction there. But in any case, he's trying to expand, to make Chris Anderson's notion of a long tail even more decentered than Anderson has done. Of course, the favorite from my point of view, always my favorite, is Baudrillard, and Baudrillard's work is just a storehouse of concepts and theoretical ideas to use in thinking about Web 2.0 and the internet. Just to take some of them, implosion, for example, the idea of implosion implies a contraction into one another, a fantastic kind of telescoping, a collapsing of two poles into one another. I use this idea in analyzing cathedrals of consumption like shopping malls and casinos, but implosion is limited in material structures. There's just so much implosion you can do in a shopping mall or in a Las Vegas casino. But the possibilities of implosion are much greater, even endless. And the ideas of remixing and mashup and things like that all imply this kind of implosion. Now with augmented reality involving the integration of the real world and the digital, we're seeing the implosion of the digital and the material. So the concept of implosion to me is highly relevant here. Simulations. The idea of simulations was created, of course, before the internet age. Yet one way of thinking about simulations is as copies or copies of copies. And Shirky, among others, talks about, quote, the unlimited perfect copyability of file sharing. So we have this much greater capacity on the internet to produce copies and copies of copies, as Shirky suggests. Another sense of simulations to Baudrillard is that this is a world of the fake. And his best example is Disney World. And of course, one could argue that The Sims and Second Life would also be have these kinds of elements of the fake. Baudrillard, as you probably know, differentiates between 4 orders of simulation. The first order of simulation is 10 minutes. Let's put words in my mouth. So the first order is the image is a reflection of reality. So you've got these levels of simulation, further and further degrees of simulation. And so in terms of the internet, it seems to me that Amazon and eBay would be examples of the first order kinds of simulations. Images that are reflections of reality, the bookstore, the flea market. The second level masks and perverts basic reality. And for Baudrillard, it's Disney, for example, which ironically for him, Disney World masks and perverts the basic reality, which is that the United States is a Disney World. That's a more controversial kind of argument. But one could argue that the games that one finds on the internet, called Call of Duty kinds of games, mask and pervert basic reality. The third level is perhaps the most interesting, where what is masked is the absence of reality. This is a more postmodern level as far as the orders of simulation are concerned. So one could argue, for example, that one's Facebook friends, innumerable Facebook friends, mask the fact that one has no friends in the material world. And then finally, the final level for Baudrillard is that simulations have no relationship to reality. And on the one hand, that seems provocative. On the other hand, however, it seems to be contradicted by this whole notion of convergence, and perhaps leads to some interesting kinds of questions about this fourth level of simulation as far as Baudrillard is concerned. Relatedly is Baudrillard's concept of hyper-reality. Hyper-real world is entirely within the simulation. It's more real than real. It's more beautiful than beautiful. It's truer than true. And again, Baudrillard likes Disney here as an example, which is friendlier than the real world, or cleaner than the real world. It's hyper-real. Pornography also plays that role for Baudrillard, in that it is more sexual than sex itself. And on the web, one could argue that pornography is even more hyper-real, given the possibilities of remixing and mashups of photos and videos. One of the ways that Baudrillard thinks about the contemporary world is that we live in a fractal age, where differences disappear and everything interpenetrates. Again, mashups and remixes would seem to fit well with that notion. A similar idea is the ecstatic, which for Baudrillard is this kind of endless metamorphosis, escalation for escalation's sake, everything spinning out of control, total delirium are some of the ways in which Baudrillard thinks about it. And one of the things that you have here is the loss of the referent. Everything is spinning out of control, so you lose a sense of what the ultimate reference is, or in Walter Benjamin's term, you lose a sense of the aura. So sides float forever free of their referent, if there ever was a referent. Perhaps one could say that remix and endless combinations would fit under this head. Baudrillard sees us living in an obscene age, and he means obscenity here in a different way than we usually use the term. The obscene for him is where everything is visible, where everything is broadcast, where there is uninterrupted social commentary. Clearly, one could think about Facebook and many other aspects of Web 2.0 from this point of view. And a contrast to what Baudrillard prefers, which is the scene. And the scene for Baudrillard constitutes some level of concealment. He prefers some level of concealment to this total obscenity of making everything visible. Another one of my favorite Baudrillard concepts is the strength of the weak. And the argument could be made that Web 2.0 demonstrates the strength of the weak, so that Google's algorithms give great power to individual choices. And one could even relate this, of course, to the Twitter and Facebook revolutions that we have seen occur in various places. Those raise questions about the applicability of Durkheim's notion of emergence. Can you have emergence on Google or on Twitter, on Facebook? Because for Durkheim, emergence requires some sort of face-to-face interaction. So we need a kind of alteration of the concept of emergence. And I think that represents a kind of interesting theoretical issue, and that is, how do we think about emergence where there is no face-to-face interaction? Which is part of a broader question of not just looking back to theoretical ideas that were important in the past, but also looking forward and using these as a base to create new theoretical ideas. I think the weakness of this kind of thing is I'm embedding my analysis in historical ideas here. But what we really need to do is to develop new ideas. And I think Baudrillard's strength is to have developed very contemporary ideas decades ago. The base of Baudrillard's thinking lies in the concept of what he calls symbolic exchange. In many ways, his most important book is Symbolic Exchange and Death. Symbolic exchange for him is taking and returning, giving and receiving, a cycle of gifts and counter-gifts. And it seems to me we see a similar kind of thing in the literature on the internet. For example, in Tapscott and Williams' notion of the culture of generosity, Anderson's free, Lessig's sharing, Wikipedia, Linux, Firefox, all can be looked at, it seems to me, from the point of view of this symbolic exchange, rather than from the point of view of economic exchange. And obviously, Baudrillard is creating this idea as an alternative to economic exchange. So I'm probably out of time. 2 minutes, okay, perfect. My conclusions. So what I want to argue is that postmodern ideas are far better suited to the internet, to social media, than they were to the social realities in the era in which they were created. That is, they did not apply as well to the social realities on the ground in the 1970s and 80s as they do to the social realities as they exist today, particularly on the internet. So in a way, those ideas are more applicable today than when they were created, and one could argue as well that the postmodern theorists anticipated today's social realities. I want to say, and I'm hard-pressed to say, that Web 2.0 represents the ultimate postmodern world, but even though I am not an empirical sociologist, I have no empirical basis to say that. What I want to say as a basis for making that contention is Web 2.0 is a postmodern world because of the near ideal fit between it and much of postmodern theory, as I've tried to suggest here. And finally, I want to say that I think we ought to give postmodern theory a second chance, actually really a first chance, because I don't think it was ever given an adequate hearing in the United States, especially in American sociology. American sociology had very little patience to read through the text of people like Baudrillard, and I think that there is much to be gained from reading that in terms of achieving a better understanding of Web 2.0, the internet, prosumption, and whatever. Thanks.
I'm going to take questions, and I'm bringing my laptop here because we're already talking about you.
Yes. Hi, I'd like to ask ask you to comment a little bit on the irony of doing a modernist use of postmodern theory to talk about what's at stake there, and why is a postmodern sort of approach versus a modern approach of the postmodern. What's at stake in doing that? Why is that? What happens when we do that?
Well, this is Bauman's argument about sociology and postmodernity, postmodern sociology. I mean, he would argue, and I would agree, that a postmodern sociology leads you to the near insanity of Baudrillard's analysis, the later analysis, the kind of science fiction character of his analysis. It doesn't seem to get you very far. I'm a modernist. I've always been a modernist. But what I found was that people like Baudrillard offered me really good ideas to think about the social world in a modern way. And I've never had a problem integrating these ideas, but yet applying them in a modern way and developing a modern theory of the cathedrals of consumption, for example. Postmodernists would be, I think, very uncomfortable with what I'm doing. And I think Bauman does much the same kind of thing. But I think it yields much more payoff in terms of achieving understanding of the social world than would be a science fiction type analysis, a pataphysics, as Baudrillard would call it.
I'm just wondering so there are really interesting ideas about the levels of simulation and the way that Web 2.0 sort of fits into postmodern theories. And I'm not a sociologist, but I'm wondering what, if anything, they say about where we are expected to go after this.
That would be a very modern question. I don't think postmodernists would want to sit around as modern Marxists did and speculate about where we're going or the teleology or that kind of thing. And I don't really much care where they think we're going. I mean, there are a lot of them, and they think different things. Most of the time, they don't think about that question because it's too modern. But for me, it's tools for understanding the social world. It's a toolkit for understanding the social world. And what I found is that my toolkit expanded dramatically when I got a better understanding of postmodern theory. Whatever it is they intended with it, whatever they wanted to do with it, I've been able to utilize it in various ways. And also, it's new ideas. Going through that litany of Baudrillard's ideas, for example, I'm not sure how familiar you are with all of those, but they're still pretty new ideas. And I found them exciting when I first started reading them in the 80s, and I still find them to be exciting.
I'm afraid this might be some digression. And I'm very impressed by your quotation of Clay Shirky and Chris Anderson and even Axel Frunz. They are very specialist. Well, they have a good evidence of field, but in terms of academic tradition, they cannot be regarded as theorists. So, do you think we have to embrace this kind of field, specialist as theorists of the theory of Web 2.0? And if you think, what's the reliability and the validity of their method and theory? Do we need a new criterion for theorists? That's my question.
I don't regard them as theorists. They have insights in them, in their work that I find useful and that I can integrate into my own work. But I don't regard them as theorists. In fact, they were in the main atheoretical. I mean, that's the starting point of this, is that most of the literature is totally or near totally atheoretical. And so it's highly limited from that point of view. Also, they're writing for a general audience, for a trade audience. They want to be read by a broad audience. And so the result is you know, when I read that work, the amount of return on my reading time is very small. You know, as
Hence why we appreciate the yellow pads with the returns directly delivered.
I think Baudrillard doesn't have enough empirical evidence compared to Fleischer.
theorizing the web. That word is not permitted in this.
I'm going to interject a question myself that I've been seeing too, and that I have a question as part of this conceptualization rests upon a dualist take on internet here versus the world here, I think, like Facebook friends not being real, Facebook, there I go, simulation, it's sort of being this, whereas, I mean, it's conceptualizing the virtual world as a separate world that is not of this world, and I think that's my biggest critique of a lot of postmodern theory, is that they're looking at television and there's a much more point to it than the internet, which I see maybe the augmented reality is a better term for it, as a part of this world, so that would be a critique of your approach.
Well, I don't think it, I mean, I was just trying to think about, you know, it's a thought experiment. I'm trying to think about Web 2.0 from the point of view of these concepts. And it does sort of isolate it, although a couple of times I did talk about the relationship between the convergence idea. But I don't think it's necessary to do that. I mean, if you want to think of the internet more as an augmented reality and you want to use those concepts, that would be another kind of thought experiment that might be useful for doing. But I think it's just, you know, separating out something for analytical purposes rather than thinking of it as separable from the rest of the social world.
Dave, and then
Because the web we got is not Snow Crash, it's Minority Report. And so if we want to talk about Snow Crash, Baudrillard is really good.
Yeah.
But if we want to talk about Minority Report, when the simulations are on top of us, I don't think they're simulations anymore.
they are part of the world. That's the critique, is that it's not a, a separate.
I think postmodern theory is useful. I'm just not convinced Baudrillard is the place to go. I'm trying to think of who, like Hart Mandarin maybe, or those kind of things, rather than think of, like, who helps us think about Minority Report? Grusin, but he's gone. Just like yesterday. But like that kind of thinking rather than simulation.
Minority Report, that's the Tom Cruise movie?
Yeah.
Where the augmented
I'm
reality.
dredging my memory from, I actually, unbelievably, I read Snow Crash, but I'm dredging my memory from Minority Report and pointing that. But look, I don't think it's, to me it's not Baudrillard and the totality of Baudrillard's work, it is whether he created a variety of ideas, again, that can be useful parts of this toolkit. So the question is not Baudrillard, but the question is the 6 or 8 or 10 concepts that I used, and do they give you traction in terms of thinking about the internet? You have to make, maybe you need some empirical data.
Yes.
I teach in a department of English, and so we went through our postmodern theory moment about 20 years ago. And one of the dangers of approaching digital culture with or through postmodern theory, I think, is this tendency for one to reinforce or reify the other, right? So you have people like George Landau or Richard Lanham or Jay Bolter writing in the late 80s and early 90s where they're like, postmodern theory, the computer, your argument is invalid, basically, right? Sort of saying like one sort of demonstrated the validity of the other in this kind of closed loop that actually turned out to be not at all theoretical or critical, right? But simply evidentiary. The computer was evidence of the realness of postmodern theory, and postmodern theory gave a kind of intellectual or critical heft to a set of practices you could do on the computer. Do you see a similar process maybe being a danger in sociology?
It could be, but the truth is that I wrote a book, a textbook on postmodern social theory. It's one of many theory textbooks I've written. It's the only one that ever failed. And nobody bought it. Nobody in the United States wanted to read it. Nobody in the United States wanted to teach a course in postmodern social theory. So I think the greater danger is ignorance of the theory, an outright dismissal of it. It's sort of like when I first got into sociology, people used to dismiss Talcott Parsons. And I would get angry and I'd say, well, what aspect of Parsons' work are you dismissing? And if you didn't have to probe very far to discover that the only thing they had read about Parsons, they had never read Parsons, but they had read C. Wright Mill's dismissal of Parsons in the sociological imagination. And it was on that basis they were dismissing Parsons. So, you know, my problem is that sociology didn't take it seriously. They didn't want to bother with it. They didn't want to get immersed in it. And so, American sociology. And so they just didn't do it. Whether that leads to other problems or not is an interesting question. It might be interesting to compare 1990 and 2010. Do we have a different world out there? And does this help or hinder us in terms of understanding? But there's a bigger danger, which is this obscene kind of dismissal of postmodern theory.
Well, with that, unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap it up. I would rather just give up our panel too. This is a very interesting conversation, but I'm not sure the other panelists would agree with that. So thank you very much for